Frank Herbert encodes into the world building of his legendary science fiction novel Dune one of his most powerful and, I believe, relevant ideas for where we are in our world today. That each of the worlds we discover in Dune, be it the world of Arrakis, Dune, Desert Planet, the world of Caladan, home of House Atreides, the world of Gidi Prime, home of House Harkonnen. All of these worlds are medieval fiefdoms. They are ruled over by a single family who wield power over the entire planetary population. And we learn, in fact, from the House Atreides, who are as closer to good guys in the world of Dune as we're going to get in that deeply morally compromised universe that Herbert depicts for us, that even House Atreides rule with land and air power. So they're continually exerting military domination over that population. But maybe even more importantly, they rule through information, through propaganda. They're continually controlling, consciously, deliberately controlling, as an elite, the ideas that are circulating among that population so that they can, as a single family, a single elite, if we want to call them that, keep control of that world. And of course, Frank Herbert was on one level depicting a medieval fantasy in space. That is one idea unfolding and powering Dune along as a work of fiction. But he's also giving us a warning about our past, our present, and our potential futures. Because when we look at the power structures of human civilization in the history of our planet, we can see certain patterns unfolding again and again. And one of those patterns is a movement between what we can call authoritarianism, or at its most extreme, complete totalitarian rule, the tyrant, the totalitarian dictator in more modern times, that one individual, sometimes one family over a long period of time in an inherited monarchy, are able to take complete power over an entire population of people, and they all have a power structure that allows that to stay in place. But this power structure is never going to change unless there are outside competitors. Because at the other end of this civilizational spectrum, we have republics, where you have things like a senate, or maybe even a parliament, some representation of the people in some form, and democracies as well, be it of the kind of the ancient Greek city-states, which were, would we consider them democracies today when they were still slaveholders and it was only the rich land-owning men in the civilization who voted? But still, this is some form of democracy because it balances different power factions. And what we see repeating in history over and over again, that democracies and republics arise when you have many states competing for power next to each other. So in that situation of ancient Greece, you have over a dozen major city-states across ancient Greece, and they're all competing. So they have to develop faster. They have to develop the best technology. They have to get the most from the citizens of their little city-state or nation-state surrounding it. And you see that pattern going on and on again. And in 20th century history, we have had this intense competition between states, which definitely has good and bad, but it tends towards either republics or democracies, and to an increase of freedom so that every human in that civilization is as productive and creative as possible. But at going back to our earlier state of authoritarian or totalitarian control, perhaps through a monarch or a priesthood or a single aristocratic family, whatever it may be, it's the same authoritarian control. We see that if a civilization, we could look to ancient Egypt, which was able to maintain simply one totalitarian system for thousands of years, because its geography meant it really didn't have to interact, and consequently it didn't really develop as a civilization. You can also look to the vast empire of ancient China, which was for thousands of years essentially deliberately stymied its technological development, because anything new or changing was seen as challenging the rule of the imperial empire of China. But one of the consequences of that is that it would then be conquered or colonized by outsiders who had developed faster in their technological development. And if you're out there, if I can give you an illustration of this, if you played any of the Civilization games, Sid Meier's Civilization, I think I played number 5, possibly the most of these, and you have in there the technological development tree, a kind of timeline with different avenues that you could go down to fully develop the technology of your civilization. I'm sure most of you can picture that as a metaphor for what we're discussing here. And then the question that I would put to you, that we could put out for discussion, is how long would it take from a standing start, from chipping your first stone axe, how long, or maybe it would be better to phrase it as how fast could you get to the end of the technological development tree, let's say to a starship, perhaps, some kind of technological form that can take you to other worlds and being a multi-planetary civilization. How fast could you do that? Because it's taken humanity, you could phrase this in many ways, but let's say something like 150,000 years of development to go from the stone axe or some kind of Neolithic civilization to perhaps where we are today, some kind of high technological civilization with the internet and decoding DNA and all of the wonderful technological achievements that we have. But how fast could you do that? And I'd like to put it on the table between us that humanity could have done that from a standing start in 500 years. If you just took some Neolithic humans who are biologically identical to us, we've experienced no real biological evolution in that time, and gave them good circumstances, but one major factor, that civilization would never come under authoritarian or totalitarian control, that it would never end up dominated by one elite, by a king, by an aristocratic clan, by a priesthood, by a totalitarian ideology, whatever it is that ends up in that position, and then deliberately prevents the development of the civilization as a strategy to hold on to its own power. And of course, we see this illustrated in Frank Herbert's legendary Dune. We have this famous phrase in Dune, "Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind," a phrase which is being very much abused at the moment, often used by people on the more Luddite end of the spectrum, or perhaps the more authoritarian end of the spectrum, to say that we shouldn't develop these emergent pieces of a possible artificial intelligence that we have at the moment, like machine learning, LLMs, that they present whatever it is a threat to, and we should stop their development. And this quote from Frank Herbert is often deployed. Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. But let's remember the simple fact that the universe of Dune is deliberately constructed by Frank Herbert as a backwards, uber totalitarian galaxy. The known universe of mankind in Dune is just an absolutely oppressive, totalitarian galactic civilization under an emperor and a small number of a few great houses who dominate an entire world. And that it's possible, that Frank Herbert's warning to us is that it's possible for an entire planetary population, billions of human beings, to come under permanent control of just one family, one clan, one priesthood, one totalitarian ideology, because there is no competition. Because once you have control over the whole world, there is no route for freedom, and there's no need to continue your technological development because you're simply holding on to power, and as long as you're at the top of that power structure, the development of the civilization is irrelevant to you. It's much better to stay without development, and that's what we're warned about by Frank Herbert, the possibility of an entire world being dominated, and via the use of misinformation, of a fake religion, issues fake commandments. Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind, which is over and over again implied to be an entirely fake religious commandment used simply to wield power over the populations of the Dune universe. And this is Frank Herbert's warning to us. And I fear that we are now on the precipice of a situation where we have to take Frank Herbert's warning very seriously. We're transitioning from a 20th century where we were somewhere in the region of 200 nation states, some very powerful, some much less so, all competing. And this providing an engine towards an increase in freedom, an increase in wealth, an increase in innovation, technology, fundamentally of human creativity, facilitated by human freedom. That now we are moving towards becoming one world. Almost any human being on the planet can pick up a smartphone today and contact almost any other human being. And we're becoming more and more one global civilization, inevitably. And this is a wonderful thing. And there is immense potential for a golden age of humanity to come from this, but there is also the potential for one authoritarian or totalitarian power, however it is represented, to take complete control of our planet. And sadly, if I was to give that, of course you could never measure something like this statistically, but just for the sake of our discussion today, I fear that we're at something like a 70% chance of that authoritarian or totalitarian future that Herbert warned against coming true. Hello and welcome to the Science Fiction Podcast with Damien Walter. And today we are discussing one of the darker and heavier issues that I have brought to you all as listeners of this fine podcast. And I put that there for you as a little bit of a disclaimer and perhaps a trigger warning that if you're in an emotionally sensitive place at the moment, if you don't want dark dreams and nightmares dogging your unconscious through the day and the night, then maybe you don't want to listen to this episode of the Science Fiction Podcast, because it's going to be quite a heavy episode. We're going to be framing some of this discussion around the free body problem. Luce Swan's very successful science fiction trilogy, most recently adapted for Netflix. And I believe that there is a very, very major problem with the free body problem. And we're going to be discussing that in some detail and then moving through to think about the larger frame that I believe the free body problem sits within. And that is this issue of a potential authoritarian future ahead of us. I think a future that for many people might seem rather unrealistic, but I'm going to try and make it feel much more realistic for you. And that will be the final warning. To turn back now if you do not want to know what I believe I may know, at least in part at the moment. And we're also going to discuss some of the need for a 21st century mythos to answer this. And I'm going to put on the table for you, hopefully in a final optimistic note, an idea about what I believe might have to be at the heart of that 21st century mythos. This is a commentary for a number of episodes that have passed on the Science Fiction channel. As regular listeners will know, the Science Fiction brand as such covers a science fiction YouTube channel, this science fiction podcast, and also the science fiction community on Facebook, where we just passed 40,000 members. Make sure you're subscribed for all free. Subscribe to the channel. Make sure you have the RSS feed for the public episodes of the podcast. Join the community. You can also become a member. Donate a few dollars a month. You can do that on YouTube, on Substack, on Patreon, and at DamianGWalter.com, and you get access to all of the back episodes of the podcast. You get all of my courses and a lot of other good stuff. And that's very useful to do at the moment because we're going through a little bit of a lull on the YouTube channel. This happens from time to time. We've had over 4 million individual, actual separate people, 4 million separate people have watched the science fiction channel over the last 4 months. We're averaging about, a bit longer than that, 6 months, and we're averaging about 500,000 views a month in that period. That's fantastic. But when you get so many people in at the same time to a YouTube channel, they start to drift away a bit. And then it looks to the algorithm like your material is a bit less interesting. I'm not going to bore you much more with algorithmic issues here, though, because there is a lot to get through in this episode. If you're brand new to the Science Fiction Podcast, if you've only seen me do the very tightly written and edited video essays on the channel, this is much more freeform. I do have notes today. Sometimes I even go without notes, but it's longer. It's a bit more rambly, but there is method to this madness. Even if I get a little bit lost along the way in this, it's because I'm trying to get to somewhere that I can't get to if I script and shoot and edit an essay. I'm trying to get some kind of insight that comes from this process of talking, sometimes for an hour or even 2 hours. We have gone over the 2-hour mark with a couple of these episodes. Many people enjoy this much more than the very tightly edited episodes. Some people who are long-term listeners have told me that they just put these on and fall asleep. I'm not sure how to take that. I often fall asleep listening to people whose voices I like, so I do understand it, but I hope you sometimes are awake when listening. And anyway, for new listeners, I hope that gives you some context to the rather more unusual presentation of these episodes. And one more point in the housekeeping here. There's going to be an announcement. The next thing you will hear on this podcast feed is an announcement for the Ocean of Story, which was a Kickstarter project that we successfully landed back in the summer of 2023. No, it was more like September time, I think, wasn't it? Yes. And there's going to be an announcement relating to that storytelling project, because I have quite a lot to update you all on, but we will come to that when we come to that. I'm going to take a quick sip of rather nice apple juice here for a second. These episodes are also unedited. I now have an ice cube in my mouth. Okay. That was entirely unplanned. These episodes are also unedited, so there's the occasional gap where I just take breath, or I may even go a bit slowly or just pause at times for thought, because we have some quite complex issues to discuss, not least what will be the title of this episode, the three-body problem. Members of the science fiction community, people who've seen my video essay on the three-body problem, the small army of trolls from presumably employed by an agency of the Communist Party of China, who have commented on that video essay over the months that it's been up, will know that I have a bit of a problem with the free body problem. And I haven't gone into complete detail and depth about that problem. And I'll give some context here. And I think one of the reasons why I've been a little bit loath to do that is because I am not an expert on the politics of the great nation of China. I can give a disclaimer here that I am in no way xenophobic or anti-Chinese. My only issue with the great nation of China is its current, apparently quite authoritarian government, which worries me deeply, because I'm a person who individually in my life highly values my own individual freedoms, and I want to see humanity fulfill our highest path as a free civilization, far more free than we are now. An upcoming episode, which I'm putting a lot of time and work into for the science fiction channel, I think it's going to be somewhere between an hour and 2 hours, by far the longest video essay, all dedicated to the culture of E&M banks. The title of the essay is Hippies with Guns, the Culture of E&M Banks. This is a quote from an interview with E&M Banks that I published many years ago. It's not a very well-known quote, but he did say it now and again, that the culture were hippies with guns. And the culture is a civilization, a human future civilization of absolute freedom. And that's what I want to see for humanity. And the core of my problem with the free body problem is that it depicts a future for humanity that is the opposite of free, that is absolutely authoritarian or totalitarian. And it argues that is the only possible future for humanity. And that would be fine. There are many such works of science fiction in existence, but the spear tip of my problem with the free body problem is that, as well as being an incredibly bleak and unpleasant future, the free body problem is a work of propaganda, which has been at the very least approved, and I have very good reason to think is strongly supported by the current authoritarian government in China. And just to round off that point about why I've been slightly reluctant to put this all together, is to put this in context, I'm going to have to make some statements about the authoritarian government of China and its current shape at the moment. And we'll get into this. Now, I would be overjoyed to be proven wrong about any of what I say here, because I am indeed not an expert on the politics of the great nation of China. But to be proven wrong is very different from being repeatedly told I'm wrong by an army of paid trolls, which is, the experience that I have had so far, veering off into this topic. But I think to open this up, we have to consider what I mean when I say the word propaganda, because we have a very negative valence attached to the word propaganda with some good purpose. It took on that very negative image really through the early to mid 20th century, and especially the period when propaganda was being used both in Nazi Germany and in the Soviet Union and many other places as well, because propaganda is almost universal. There is propaganda in every nation. Every major corporation has propaganda of a kind, but it's often just not called propaganda. It's called public relations, PR for short, which is the same two letters at the beginning of the word propaganda, so it's easy to remember. That change was made by Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, who is the father of the public relations industry. He was an employed propagandist in World War I for the CIA, and he then went to work to make propaganda for corporations, essentially advertising, but he renamed it public relations, always involved with that renaming. And he had a very famous campaign where he employed suffragettes, who were at the time kind of rich young female socialites in the city of New York, to, on one of their marches, smoke cigarettes to promote the idea that cigarettes were related to female emancipation, which, of course, if you get cancer from cigarettes, you haven't been very emancipated. But that's the kind of thing that public relations, which is just another name for propaganda, does all the time. And propaganda does not necessarily need to be bad. I think to be considered good at all, propaganda or public relations have to be open about their agenda. So when a charity, say like Friends of the Earth, a charity that I think is reasonably ethical in its messaging in the world, is communicating its message to the world, it is a kind of propaganda, but it's not a bad propaganda. It's trying to raise awareness of specific issues, and it tells you it's an activist organization, and that's what it's doing. The major problem with propaganda is when you don't know, you're being exposed to a set of ideas that are communicating a very deliberate agenda, which is perhaps designed to persuade you of something. And an important idea to understand about propaganda is a major shift in the nature of propaganda. That what we think about as propaganda from early to mid 20th century was modern or modernist propaganda. It's from the modern era of communications. And the aim of, let's say, Soviet propaganda was to persuade you that capitalism was bad and weak, and that communism would inevitably overtake it and reach a communist utopia. And I believe that is a false message, as I think most people do, although there are many Marxists who like to comment on the science fiction channel, so you can continue making your argument. But modern propaganda had something it wanted to recruit you to, whether it was doing that openly or covertly. We now live in an era of postmodern propaganda. And as soon as I explain postmodern propaganda, if you aren't aware of it, you will instantly recognize how prevalent it is in our media today. Modern propaganda wanted you to believe something. Postmodern propaganda wants you to believe nothing. It wants to move you into a state where it doesn't matter what information you are given, you won't believe it. One very common outcome of postmodern propaganda is the belief that all nations are equally corrupt. This is summarized in the kind of thing that you will hear a politician who's a very postmodern politician like Donald Trump say. Donald Trump will say something, or who is one of his political sidekicks. The guy who recently interviewed Putin in Russia, I should be able to remember his name, but Tucker Carlson, who is the epitome of a postmodern propagandist. They will just throw onto the table a very postmodern propaganda point like, yeah, but we kill people. The American president kills people. Now, there's a very important distinction here that of course, America is engaged, it's a nation state with killing people, but it has a whole framework of legal checks and balances, of investigations. But people who've been really absorbed into postmodern propaganda, which exists across the political spectrum. So if you go to the quite far right with something like Fox News or the Breitbart website, or if you go to the other side on the left, a UK source like Novara Media, they're both postmodern propaganda, and they're trying to persuade you that there is nothing to believe. There are no good guys. There is no side to be on. Everything is relative. And there's a right-wing relative postmodern propaganda and a left-wing relative postmodern propaganda, but they both have the same effect of depoliticizing people, of taking a population to the point where they no longer think that there is anything to believe in. And whatever issue is put in front of them, an example would be something like the invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces in the last 2 or so years. And people who have been very exposed to postmodern propaganda will respond to that just with an endless set of equivocations and that everything is relative. So, yeah, but the Ukrainians are just as corrupt as the Russians, or maybe they're part of Russia. Or the Russians aren't really that bad and Ukrainians are Nazis. And it's an endless list of just postmodern propaganda points. And it's important to understand that distinction if we're going to talk about free body problem. Because the free body problem is postmodern propaganda. There are big ideas in free body problem, but it's not essential that you believe them, because the outcome of the free body problem is that it just adds to the postmodern condition of believing nothing. And that there is no point in believing anything, because the fundamental nature of the universe as depicted in the free body problem is hopeless. There is no hope in the free body problem. And that's a deliberate construction of Lu Swan. And it's one of the reasons why the book is popular. The free body problem, popular, to be specific, on 2 levels. Popular with the current authoritarian government in China. We're going to get into the reasons why. And more broadly popular with an increasing group of people who, at various different levels, hold a very bleak worldview. A worldview that emerges a bit like a river. It has thousands of sources, but the outcome of all of these put together is that many people now in our world, many of you listening, I suppose, and I'm not attacking you for this, but I'm just pointing to it. hold a very bleak worldview of an empty universe, that any encounter with life is going to be bound to be hostile, another issue from the free body problem. And there's lots of parts to this, but the free body problem really appeals to this because the free body problem is a simple story. It's very long, and I believe it's quite tedious because I also don't think Liu Cixuan is a particularly good writer. He's a good symbolic thinker, and that gives him these interesting high concepts that science fiction readers enjoy. And it also allows him to put into his books very clear ideas that are very pleasing to some people, but we'll come back to that in a second. The free body problem is a very simple story. What happens in the free body problem? We join the story a little bit back in history, going back to the 1960s, and the crazy Maoists, the hardcore socialists in China, under the direction of Mao Zedong, have turned the country to chaos. And as a response to that chaos, a liberal intellectual, a scientist, is taken in by the lies of a very aggressive alien species, and she gives them the invite to come to Earth. And this is a classic setup of authoritarian thinking, that you have kind of revolutionary forces who are the crazy Maoists, but then you also have liberal forces, and neither are to be trusted because they're both undermining order. And at its root, the free body problem is a story about order and the need for absolute order. And at the heart of this story is a symbol, which is the free body problem itself. What is the free body problem an illustration of? For those who don't know, mathematically, it is possible to calculate the trajectories of two bodies that are interacting with each other. For instance, a planet around a star. But once you step that up to three bodies, you can no longer predict the trajectories. And what the free body problem tells us, to somewhat simplify, is that reality is chaos. Reality is fundamental chaos, flux, void, disorder. And that's very important to grasp as the symbolic heart of free body problem. As I say, Liu Cixuan's strength is as a symbolic thinker and is in coordinating sets of ideas. So what is then the rest of free body problem? Well, the rest of free body problem is you have a civilization called the Trisolarans. And the Trisolarans are unable to build a truly orderly society that would last in perpetuity. And remember, the name for the ancient Chinese empire was the eternal empire under God. It would be eternally ordered. And the Trisolarans can't do that because they live in a free body solar system. That means they build a civilization and it's knocked down again. So in response to that, what the Trisolarans have done is invade others. The nature of their chaos means they have to escape their own system and invade a truly orderly civilization built by others. And I don't think you have to understand much about modern China today to understand that this is how many Chinese, especially Chinese nationalists, see the West. And especially England. And I have a feeling that the Trisolarans are something of a picture of English colonialism. Another thing to say in here is that China has many good reasons to be very angry at the world. In its 2-century fall from being the wealthiest, most powerful empire in the world, it was colonized many times by the Japanese, by the English in slightly different ways, who were terrible to the Chinese people. So there's really, really good reason for a lot of Chinese nationalism. That doesn't make it right, ultimately, in my view. But there are absolutely reasons there. But then you can also balance that with the fact that the reason Chinese society was outcompeted industrially was because it had had this very long stagnancy as an empire, which didn't allow proper technological development, which was authoritarian and totalitarian. But I think you can see that this is how many Chinese people today would see the relationship with the West, because the West is capitalist and chaotic. Capitalism is chaotic. Capitalism is a free body system. What you have illustrated in that trisolaran system, you can build a civilization in this chaotic system, but then there are crises, unpredictable crises of the system. And what is the key critique? What is the key Marxist and then communist and socialist critique of capitalism? That it looks like capitalism is providing development, technological growth, and so on, but then it hits crises, and those crises are devastating. And of course, we're talking now at a time when Western capitalism, from somewhere around 2008, is in a kind of state of crisis. You have symbols of this, evidence of this, 0% interest rates, massive inflation of asset prices, vast gap between rich and poor, and the Gini coefficient, lots more, the inability of younger generations to buy into a property market, which is the main store of value and security and a status in society, and a very strong possibility of a very major economic collapse in Western capitalism. May or may not happen. I am not a seer of the future. But this is what the free body problem is talking about. This is who the trisolarans are in that quite powerful symbolic thinking of Lu Swan. And I think they're also English, because the response to this is to be the trisolaran personality is very cold, emotionless, controlled, because they have to deal with this situation of chaos that they find themselves in. And that's quite an accurate depiction, especially of the English of the period of the colonialist era. These very controlled, emotionless beings. Now, of course, that's not actually how English people are. It's certainly not how Chinese people are, how Chinese people see themselves. And in a weird move, some of the defenders of Lu Swan claim that the trisolarans are the Chinese, and this is all a big critique of China. And I'm afraid that's just desperately unrealistic. And the main reason it's unrealistic is because it simply doesn't take into account that the undeniable and very real systems of censorship that are in place in China today. And to understand those systems, you have to think about the political system in China, which is best described as a Leninist power structure. So Vladimir Lenin, a great revolutionary figure, a deeply unpleasant person in many ways, killed literally millions of people. But he was a thinker about revolution and how to create revolution, and how to destroy the existing power structures of a nation, which was, for him, was the Tsarist regime of Russia. And his argument was that you needed to found a party. And this party is not like the Republicans or the Democrats or the Labour Party or the Tories, political parties in the democratic system. It is an insurgent power structure until it takes control, and then it just becomes the power structure. So something like 1 in 8 people in China are members of the Communist Party, which is a Leninist power structure in the country. Every significant company, certainly every media company, every corporation, every technology outlet, every school and university has representatives of the party members who work there, and some who are also just monitoring. And one of the things that this party structure does is censorship. So there are many tiers and layers of censorship in China. And Liu Cixuan, to become a successful published writer, especially a science fiction writer, around 2011, 2012, at a time when China seemed to be moving in a somewhat more liberal direction. I was researching Chinese science fiction. I was making a funding proposal to visit China. And I was told from a number of sources, quite serious sources, basically to stop that work for my own safety, that it would probably be unsafe for me to do, because I was also writing at The Independent and The Guardian. I was quite outspoken on a number of cultural, political issues. And the combination of that meant that there were risks associated to what I was trying to do. I was quite sad about that, but I took that advice at the time. And one of the things that happened is that I was emailing with a number of people who are involved with science fiction, academics, writers. And one of the things I picked up is that many, not all, but many of those people did not like Liu Cixuan very much, because he was seen as an approved author. That's why he kept winning the Galaxy Award. I think it's either the Galaxy or the Nebula. It's why he kept being published, why his stories and then his books received so much promotional support, both in China and outside it. And you could understand if we were in a situation in America where you had an American science fiction writer who kept winning the Hugo Award because the government censors said that he should. That would anger many people, whether it's a fair anger towards that individual writer or not. And that appears to have been the situation with Liu Cixuan. Now, this was not new. He didn't just write The Free Body Problem and had that approved through these kind of layers of censorship. So for more detail about how that would work, an editor working at a magazine, those editors are appointed by the party, local, regional party officials. So they're going to be thinking about what they need to do to please the party, and applying that on the micro scale. And then on the macro scale, now and again, you would have something happen like an issue of the magazine is going to be taken to the chief bureaucrat of the party in that region. He'll look at it and see if he likes it or not. And if he doesn't, there's going to be consequences to that. Layers of consequences. That's how a Leninist party structure works. So Liu Cixuan very successfully navigated that. And there's an excellent video essay on the YouTube channel Bucketful of Eternity, which analyzes all of the stories in A Wandering Earth, which collects all of Liu Cixuan's fiction. All but one of the stories is from before Free Body Problem, I believe, and then one is from afterwards. And the video essay excellently dissects, I'm not going to go into its details here because there's not enough time, but, the symbol, as a great symbolic thinker, the symbol in each of those stories, which was a clear appeal to that party power structure and how it sees and understands itself. So once Liu Cixuan got to the point of publishing Free Body Problem, he had earlier novels as well, these have all been approved. So he's now an approved writer. So it's not specifically that some shadowy cabal sat down and said, this book is going to do something in the world. It's simply that Liu Cixuan has built that reputation as a writer who can be trusted to communicate messages that are appreciated out in the world. Now, I need to clarify here what I'm asking of people, because I have been boycotting Free Body Problem, but I'm not asking other people to boycott Free Body Problem. I'm not asking for the book to be removed from bookshops or anything of that kind. I'm making, and my boycott is as a critic. As a critic, I'm not going to review the TV show. I'm not going to review the books. I'm not going to give them that kind of positive attention. Whenever I might do that, instead, I'm doing this kind of thing. Because nobody else is doing this. So you can look through, okay, I haven't read all of the reviews of Free Body Problem. Maybe somebody has done it. I've looked at the major reviews and there's no mention of any of this. There is mention, of course, of Lu Swan has made comments about the ongoing, I would classify, it hasn't been officially classified as a genocide, but it looks very much like a genocide of Uyghur Muslims through things like forced sterilization, placement in labor camps, separation of families, and so on in northern China. And the Uyghurs live in what is a whole region of northern China that has been colonized over a long period. So it is unusual that there is not more anger about that. But my real issue is that the lack of awareness of what Free Body Problem is. So there is a YouTube channel, Quinn's Ideas. I don't know Quinn at all. I'm not a regular viewer of his channel. I can't really be too critical of Quinn for this because it's a real fanish channel. Quinn just talks about how much he loves bits and bobs in all the stories he talks about, and he repeats a lot of what the story is for people, and that's great. All power to him. But for me, there just seems to be a lack of a responsibility to be constantly talking about Free Body Problem and to give no context around it, about the layers of censorship it might have come through and what the story actually means in the context of China today. There seems to just be a lack of responsibility there. So I'm trying to take on some of that responsibility and actually talk about this. And what I would like people to do is just be aware. Just be aware of the context that Free Body Problem has come from and how the symbolism of the story actually works. And of course, this is difficult for people to do because we live at the moment in a culture that I have never experienced any state censorship. As a professional writer working for top media publications, in and out of big media organizations, never. Not once. But what you have in contrast to that is very great commercialization of our media. And that commercialization really disencourages people from thinking critically about media. So most of our science fiction storytelling, there's very little critical thinking about it. It's great that we've had Dune come out, the movies, and we're entering into a culture of critical thought, but we have to bring that to a Free Body Problem as well. Let's have a think about a couple more of those symbols in Free Body Problem, and then we'll think a bit more about its political context in China. So let's just think about the Dark Forest. So it's not really introduced until the second book. But the Dark Forest theory is probably the big win of Free Body Problem as a work of propaganda. Whether you think it is positive or negative propaganda, that is certainly what it is. And the Dark Forest theory is really the big win because what it states is this. The answer to the Fermi paradox, why when we look out to the stars and we should see massive evidence of life, because life will be able to move from one star to another, construct megastructures, that kind of thing. But instead we see nothing. So why is that? So the Dark Forest theory, I've been informed, is not, the theory of it doesn't come from Luby. He gives it this symbol, the Dark Forest. And he certainly adds most of the detail to it in his very long, and I would say quite tedious, exposition. Lou is really a writer of exposition. He is Mr. Exposition. It's all just info dumping. But it's not really fair of me to mix these two things. I don't think Lewis is a very good writer. That's its own issue. On the other hand, I think he's a pretty effective propagandist. And mixing them isn't really fair in this critique. So I'll put the slightly underhand attacks on Lew's extremely tedious writing to the side for now and just focus on the propaganda issues. Because the Dark Forest is a brilliant propaganda idea. What it says is this, that galactic civilizations face a game theoretic problem, that if they reveal their position, they could just get an asteroid chucked at them or a Sophon sent to interfere with them. So you don't want to reveal your position. Hence, civilizations realize this, so the galaxy, the universe is dark. It's a dark forest of suspicious civilizations glimpsing out from behind the tree trunks, and maybe someone occasionally turns on a flashlight just to shoot somebody else. That is the dark forest metaphor. And it's a metaphor for the way that intensely paranoid authoritarian or totalitarian powers want you to see reality. Because this is the ultimate get out of jail free card for authoritarianism, that we can't communicate with other civilizations. We can't talk to the other nations of the world. Oceania must be constantly at war because the game theory dictates that there is no other answer to this situation that we are in. You will be destroyed in this bleak, free body problem, chaos world, if you do not obey the authoritarian regime that it may be terrible, but is keeping you safe. And the Dark Forest theory is a brilliant win for authoritarianism as an idea, because once people adopt it as an idea, it is inescapable. But the Dark Forest theory is junk. Is complete junk. The Fermi paradox is a thought experiment. The Drake equation that is related to it is actually an example of inaccuracy in equations. What it's trying to show you is the vast uncertainties that can exist within a system that an equation represents. The Fermi paradox is a thought experiment. There is no Fermi paradox. There is no actual paradox of why we can't see alien civilizations. It is just a way to think about the nature of the universe. So there is no firm answer to it. So what is the Fermi paradox? It is a dark mirror that you project onto whatever you want to project. And the Dark Forest theory is a projection of fear, paranoia, authoritarian values, and fundamentally of nihilism. Because when we look at what an authoritarian structure is, it is ultimately an expression of nihilism, that there are no values, there is no order, there's certainly no God, and note how aggressively opposed to religion, authoritarian, ideologically authoritarian power structures are, at least in the great nation of China. So it is ultimately just a projection of absolute nihilism onto our reality. And that's rather a big win if nihilism is useful to you. Because when we were talking about postmodern propaganda before and how it is used by authoritarian regimes to take you as a citizenry to the point of depoliticization, where you believe there's nothing to believe, there is no side to join, there is no hope. This is ultimately a place of nihilism. And if you are lost in a nihilistic worldview that is imposed onto you and projected out into the universe, you are very susceptible to authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Now, there is one major objection that comes up time and again in talking about free body problem is totalitarian, and that is the depiction of the Cultural Revolution. And let's go back to how Free Body Problem is a very simple story. The crazy Maoists, the crazy revolutionaries are causing chaos in the land. And as a weak response to that chaos, the dumb liberal intellectuals give in to the appeal of the Trisolaran capitalists and give away our location as a planet. That's the simple story. But if maybe you don't have a particularly good grasp of where the politics of China are, you can see it in a different way. You can think, well, this is depicting communism as bad. You have to understand why this was actually a very intelligent thing for Liu Cixuan to write to appeal to the current party power structure in China. So if you go and look for photos, you can find a very powerful photo, and I feel great sympathy for the man, of Xi Zongzun. I'm sorry for butchering that, whoever ends up listening to this, who is the father of Xi Jinping, the current premier of China. A photo of him in a struggle session in 1967. I don't know the full details of how he came to be the focus of that struggle session, but it's essentially a lynching. He was being lynched as a highly educated person who had been within the power structure, and he was now being lynched by revolutionaries, communist revolutionaries, Maoists, under the instructions of Mao Zedong, who, and this is my understanding of why the Cultural Revolution and these struggle sessions happened, Mao Zedong was losing his power. There were more reforming powers coming through, more liberal powers, actually. And his strategy for putting himself back at the center of the power structure was to launch this Cultural Revolution, which was a massive harnessing of resentment. If you read Friedrich Nietzsche, Nietzsche will argue that actually the most powerful force in human politics is resentment. It's the resentment of those who don't have against those who do. The resentment may be valid in some sense, but that doesn't mean it should be acted upon, because once it's unleashed, resentment of that kind is extremely violent. So in great revolutions, you have this harnessing of resentment, and that's what you have in the Cultural Revolution. And who is targeted in that? But the father of Xi Jinping and the current premier of China himself, who loses all his privileges. He goes from being a princeling to being sent out into the country. So we might suggest that he doesn't like Maoists very much. And that within that Leninist power structure in China, there are factions. There's a liberal faction, there is a communist faction, a socialist faction, and there's a conservative faction and a very nationalist faction. And Xi Jinping is the nationalist faction. And he's ultimately given power in China as the second part of a deal. His predecessor was from the liberal faction. Xi is going to, or a representative of the conservative faction, is going to take over the nationalist faction. He's going to take over to balance these factions together. And what happens, Xi turns out to be much more powerful than people predict he will be. And he has been conducting a massive purge of the liberals and the communists, and establishing the very conservative nationalists as the ruling faction in the party. And basically all of Liu Cixuan's writing career is happening during the course of this power shift in China. So what you have in China now is a communist party in name, in the way that you often have these power structures. The People's Republic of Korea is the Democratic Republic of North Korea, is not democratic or a republic. And now this Leninist party structure in China is I don't think you can make any argument for it being communist. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't communist ideas used by the power structure, because their main goal is to just deploy ideas to keep hold of power. So if you read Xi Jinping's own thoughts, you will see many references to communism there. But he's essentially a conservative nationalist. And the aim of the current authoritarian powers in China is basically to return to when China was a strong nation. And I don't know if you can really blame them for this. Communism is not working out very well anywhere, and liberalism to them seems too disordered. The point of Xi's power in China now is to bring order, absolute order, back to the nation. And you have to give him his due. He's managed that on some level, although it seems to be flying apart in a massive economic crisis quite quickly, because the more the authoritarian order is imposed, the less innovation, the less real innovation you can have. And we live in a time of high-speed innovation and creativity. And in that context, you see that powerful opening scene in the book, that section is moved to the middle of the book because Liu Cixuan was worried about it. He wasn't sure what the censors were going to think about it. He's making a very clear appeal to the nationalists in China. He's saying, look, you've got the crazy Maoists, you've got the weak liberals. What we need, strong national authority to bring order and to hold off the fundamental chaos, the free body problem of reality. But that was put in the middle of the book. It's moved to the beginning of the book when the book is translated by, I've forgotten the name of the author, who's a very good author. He does a very good translation. I think he improves Liu Cixuan's tedious writing quite substantially for the English edition. I mean, I haven't read it in the original Chinese, so I can't know. But reading some other Liu's short stories that are not as well translated, you do get that idea. But I think if you understand the politics of where that Leninist power structure in China is today, where Xi is as a thinker, it's actually quite clear why that Cultural Revolution section is really part of this symbolic appeal to the censors to say, this is something that's going to please where we are, where the powers of this country are today, which is what Liu Cixuan is very good at doing. So what might we call this ideology in China? Well, I mean, you can point out that a country with a wide network of concentration camps in its north for an ethnic minority that was socialist and is now nationalist might be called a nationalist socialist country. And we know where National Socialism has taken us in the past, but I'm not sure that's ultimately a fair representation. I think what's come up as a term in the science fiction community, and I'm sorry, the individual who coined this, I don't have your name in front of me at the moment. I will try and put it in the notes for this. That a term which works quite well is authoritarianism, utilitarianism. Authoritarian utilitarianism. Let's go with that. So we don't have too many isms. Authoritarian utilitarianism, because there's something new in our situation that when we look at authoritarianism today, it's trending towards not being quite the authoritarianism of the past, as we have modern and postmodern propaganda. We also have modern and postmodern authoritarianism. And postmodern authoritarianism is much smarter. It's less interested in displays of force and fear and terror, although I think we should be aware that it's still more than willing to deploy those. So you had the situation of, a China that appears to be opening up, and you have students who think that that means that now maybe there is space to protest, to make change. And then you have the Tiananmen Square incidents, because you have what you had in the opening up of China was this kind of postmodern authoritarianism, which is much more interested in complex systems of control. And I think what the authoritarians around the world realized was that the free world, the Western capitalist world, had all of our own systems of control. And they worked much, much better for controlling a population than trying to literally keep people under power. And the heart of the Western systems of control is the ideology of utilitarianism. And I explored this in an episode on the Science Fiction channel. Now, I did warn you that this was a dark and heavy episode of the podcast. And we're now, that was just the light introduction. Now we're moving into some of the real darkness. I'm going to refresh myself with some fluids. So one of the themes we've been exploring in our thinking about contemporary science fiction storytelling was the rather interesting outbreak of Marxism at the Disney Corporation. I'm struggling a little bit with the number of comments coming in on the Science Fiction channel. I like reading comments. I like talking with people online. But as we've had that wave of 4 million people coming through the channel, there's been a lot of comments. And on some levels, YouTube operates as kind of like an engine to generate the least intelligent response to a complex argument that's being made if you're trying to do intelligent criticism on YouTube. And somebody will just say that the least intelligent possible thing. And one of the comments that came in, I think maybe on the Andor video, was Disney are a communist company. Disney or a communist company. And you really have to wonder at the loops someone has put their mind through to arrive at the idea that this massive corporation that has completely commoditized nearly all of our culture, bought all of our potentially great stories and turned them into commodities, is vastly profitable, runs these weird artificial theme parks that I don't want to judge people who go to Disney World or Disneyland, but I would never even consider going to one of those theme parks. I mean, maybe to ride the rides for a day, but the idea of going there for like a week and living in Disney World, this is the essence of capitalism, the artificiality, the hyper reality of capitalism. Disney is incredibly controlled through its narrative formulas, and then all of a sudden, the uber capitalist Disney Corporation, not at all communist, produces this kind of work of interesting Marxist storytelling that is Andor. So I think the way that this happened is that Tony Gilroy is kind of a very interesting storyteller. He's reading the life story written by Simon Sebag Montefiore of young Stalin, and he borrows a lot of young Stalin to make Andor, and that kind of generates this story of revolution, because of course Star Wars is an overarching narrative of revolution, and I think people are totally correct that the main arc of Star Wars movies is more like the American Revolution. I think that's probably largely correct, although George Lucas once in one interview, and he said a lot of stuff off the cuff, says that the Ewoks were the Viet Cong, so I don't know how seriously you can take that, but it doesn't look like a Marxist revolution, but Andor really does, and it's on lots of different levels. You have there's a character called Nemik who has literally a manifesto, very much like the kind of writing that Trotsky did about ideas of revolution and freedom. Leon Trotsky, one of the early Bolshevik revolutionaries. There's a character who appears to be very much like Vladimir Lenin, second mention for Lenin today. And Andor is kind of borrowing from, because the young life of Joseph Stalin, and in the video thumbnail, I had the direct comparison, and it is Stalin. There is some misinformation online that this is an actor and portraying Stalin. No, it is the young Joseph Stalin. There's another mugshot of him from a few years later where he's much more gaunt looking, because clearly he's having quite a tough life. But he was very heroic looking, and he lived a very heroic life. So you can understand some of the hero worship of Stalin in his younger life. Now, I'm not supporting that hero worship. He was a horrific mass murderer he murdered a lot of people before he was in power, but that's what we explore in Andor. We explore kind of the adult reality of revolutions against imperial power structures. And I think that's where the Marxism comes into the story. But there are other layers of it as well. And one of them is the Narkina 5 prison, which is utterly horrifying. So there's now a whole video essay on the channel exploring the horror of the situation which is depicted. Now, Narkina 5 seems that there is some evidence, because the designers particularly, so they just have in the script that Andor gets sent to prison. So then as they're developing this for the episodes, I think it took them something like 18 months to do those episodes, to build out the sets and so on, and then film them. They refer to the panopticon to do this, because they look into a whole bunch of dystopian prison ideas, and they get to Jeremy Bentham's panopticon. Now, condense a bit of the argument here. Jeremy Bentham is the father of utilitarianism, and what he introduces, and the panopticon is a way to introduce this, is he's trying to think about ways to control workers in factories to keep them working. And this becomes the utilitarian principle, which is at the heart of a lot of liberal thinking about politics in the West. We're going to explore this in a bit more depth, of systems to control people. So we have a phenomenon called social nudging. This came to the fore during our recent pandemic and lockdowns. People were talking a lot more about nudging. You can read more about this. I do not have the author's name in front of me, but this is kind of considered the book on nudging. It's called Nudge: Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness. Now, the idea of nudging is that you can put into place a policy that is nudging people to not smoke, that is nudging people to save for their retirement, that is nudging people to exercise or eat vegetables or do whatever it is that is for their benefit. The problem with this idea, the reason why nudging is such a terrible idea, and its adoption, and this is explored in the book Nudge. I wish I had put the author's name in my notes, so I'll try and put that in show notes as well. Now, he does try to talk about, the potential problems, the potential authoritarian problems with nudging people. Because let's say we don't call it that kind of cute word, nudging. Let's say we call it controlling. Is it good to control people for their own good? Is it fundamentally better to control people for their own good than it is to control them for your good? How do you actually know the difference? How do you know if you're controlling people for their good or for your good? And there is a great and famous critique of this Western capitalist, but really I think this is a very liberal thing, because it's liberal politics that are greatly concerned with liberating people from traditional systems of power, from traditional identity structures. But what is argued by Michel Foucault in Discipline and Punish, basically his history of how public execution was replaced with the prison system and prison terms, and we ultimately get rid of execution in many, if not all, Western countries, certainly not all, but many. But Foucault makes the argument that, look, what are we really doing in our universal education systems, in our health systems, our mental health hostels, prisons, on even the prisons? We're told that these are all here for the good of people. But actually, if we go back to the Panopticon and Jeremy Bentham and the principles of utilitarianism, we see that these are systems of control. That we are, instead of punishing people, we're using these disciplinary systems. You learn at school. So it's great. We send every child to school for education. But what we also do is train them for these kind of highly regimented workplaces. Schools have bells, uniforms, classes. You're disciplined for your behavior. None of this actually contributes to education outcomes. It is training for these kind of highly disciplined workplaces, initially factories and then bureaucratic systems, offices. And now, of course, actually we have this problem that even if you approved of the idea of society will be more productive if we train the young people properly for the kind of work they're going to be doing, and you can see an argument for that, oh dear, now we have the problem that these systems create people who aren't able to think for themselves or be creative. And now we basically increasingly only have jobs where we need people to be entrepreneurial, to be creative, to develop new technologies, to work, think outside the box, whatever it is. And our entire education system, because we built it not to educate, but to control, is totally unfit for purpose. At least I would make that argument. And we pull this all together, and what we have is a kind of a very powerful ideology of utilitarianism that is very powerful in Western countries and provides many systems of control, which are all the word I'm searching for, justified, basically, which are all justified by the utilitarian principle that, we need to do stuff which is better for the majority. Okay, so some of the outcomes of nudging people not to smoke may not be very good. There may be some issues with control, but the utilitarian argument is that this is better. And this is why you have, let's say, the Silicon Valley elites through the reframing of utilitarian ideals that is effective altruism, very popular. I think you'd have to call it a philosophy, ideology in Silicon Valley, because there is this sub-argument of effective altruism that says, well, just go and make as much money as you can. It doesn't matter what your morality in doing that is, because you're going to give away the money later. So Sam Bankman-Fried, who was, even before he was a billionaire, much before, in fact, he was a billionaire at all, when he was a trader, before he was even a trader, he was involved in the effective altruism movement. And he was attracted specifically to that argument. So that specifically gives him this motivation. Now, the effective altruist will say, no, that's consequentialism. We actually disapprove of consequentialism. But yeah, it's a difficult distinction to make, isn't it, effective altruists? But what you see there, pulling it all together, is we have this very powerful utilitarian power structure. There we go. I think that's the point we're getting to. And the authoritarians of the late 19th century, early 20th century, who had been trying to just literally impose their power, have looked at that. The modern authoritarians have looked at that, and they've arrived instead of postmodern authoritarianism, because they can just use all of those utilitarian power structures. So it's actually fine from an authoritarian point of view for China to become capitalist, because they're just implementing the capitalist control system, not the parts of it which are I would still argue, leading to greater freedoms, greater wealth, prosperity, creativity, innovation, and all of that good stuff that we hope comes along with capitalism. And I think when you unite these together, what you get is authoritarian utilitarianism. And I think that's, we can call it AU. Isn't that I think that's the symbol for gold in the big table of elements. Is there some metaphor there with gold? But let's just call it AU, authoritarian utilitarianism. I think until its recent turn towards the totalitarian, that Vladimir Putin's Russia was authoritarian utilitarianism. I think China is the paragon of authoritarian utilitarianism. I think Liu Cixuan's free body problem is a work of propaganda, really arguing for authoritarian utilitarianism and placing those values out into the world. I think the dark forest metaphor is a powerful symbol of authoritarian utilitarianism. And now I think we have a fantastic new technology for authoritarian utilitarians, for the AUs out there, which is artificial intelligence. So firstly, I don't want to demonize artificial intelligence in this section. I think artificial intelligence has tremendous potential. We should develop it. We should develop it fast, and we should implement it, and we should watch out for the first thing that AI is going to be good at. Because at the moment, I think LLMs specifically are a bit of a nothing burger. There was a massive hype around them. One of the things Silicon Valley has got very good at is creating huge amounts of hype around its new technologies. It needed big investment at the time. If you remember when AIs were releasing, we were on the brink of what was kind of looking like that inevitable crisis of capitalism that has been haunting us for some time, a recession or a depression or maybe even a full collapse. And then, woo, AI appears and Silicon Valley flares back to life. But then you actually look at like the stock exchanges and there's only 5 stocks and then 3 stocks. And now there's just NVIDIA. And I think that's crashing now, although I'm not fully up to date on what's happening this week in the trading floors. But anyway, it's all looking very wobbly. So there's this massive AI hype bubble, which is essentially holding up the entire Western economy. Now, at least I've seen that argument made. And I think it's probably a bit of a nothing burger. I think the generative AIs, I have 2 use cases. I'm using some generated imagery in videos. I find Google's Gemini to be a slightly better research tool than Googling, but that's all it is. Nothing more interesting than that has come out of it. It can't provide any real insights. It can give me a nice précis of a subject, which is a bit more effective than reading the Wikipedia entry, but I'm probably still going to read the Wikipedia entry and then go and research sources. So they're just not that useful. LLMs are a bit useful, but not very useful. They will do some very interesting things, but the people doing those things will be whole new areas of specialism, and they're not going to put people out of work, only on the very fringes of things. I know through some of my freelancing that a lot of businesses tried to implement AI solutions and have since then been returning to their old freelancing solutions because the AI solutions just aren't working. You can't actually generate all of the text for your brochure, for instance, for your sales brochure using an AI. And I don't actually think it will ever be useful for that kind of task. Now, of course, I'm not a seer. I can't actually see the future. I may be wrong, but I think where we are now, AI at this point is kind of a nothing burger. But there is going to be amazing stuff coming out of it. And there's more to come in the future as well. But I think what AI can do right here and now is implement bureaucratic, technocratic, authoritarian, utilitarian systems of control. And indeed, it's already doing this. I, in fact, deal with one of these systems. I'm a YouTuber for my sins. Now, I do that as part of a broader picture. So I think I am not subject to some of the worst pressures that many people who are simply YouTubing are. But YouTube is an AI system, predating LLMs, but I'm sure they're being integrated there. AI, machine learning, that is designed to shape the behavior of people who put content on YouTube. And is certainly designed to hold the attention of the audience and the consumers of YouTube videos. But there's absolutely no doubt that the way the YouTube algorithm dishes out attention to videos is partly influenced by, okay, well, this creator, the algorithm calculates if they're given X number of views now, they will continue to make X number more videos. I strongly suspect that that kind of thing is happening in the algorithm. It may even be happening without any human awareness that it's happening, because these algorithms, AI systems, once operating in kind of black boxes. However, I work with YouTube because I'm confident enough that it is at least a level playing field, that whatever I am exposed to through that system, most other YouTube creators are exposed to. And that makes YouTube kind of like a game. And I'm willing to play any game that I think is beneficial for me to play and that is at least reasonably fair in the rules. You never have a completely fair rule system. And I've been able to be reasonably successful at YouTube on that basis. Now, you can take exactly that same system and it can be completely unfair. I've spoken about this on past episodes, but I'll just use the example again quickly of a friend who's now left where I am in Bali, but we still chat online occasionally. I think he's changed employment now, thankfully, but he was working as a coder, quite low-level coding, to be fair. But there was this automated system that regulated his coding, and it was awful. It was like being in Narkina 5, what hours he should be working. And it wasn't that it told him, it's that its rewards were dished out through systems that he couldn't understand, whether he got new gigs or not, or something like that. And this is coming across the spectrum of our society, that where you once had a job, what you're going to have is a kind of gamified AI system that you have to produce and produce and produce for to get kind of irregular results from. I apologize, I'm becoming a little bit tired whilst talking, so I'm not fully communicating this, but I can give you a concrete example. So it's coming in work and it's coming in government, it's coming across our entire society. Indeed, it is already here. And the primary example of this is the social credit system in the great nation of China, which with its unfortunately authoritarian government. And this social credit system is now quite difficult to get information on, because if you go and read, for instance, the Wikipedia entry on the social credit system, it will tell you very calmly that it's very exaggerated, that Chinese people are constantly amused by the horror stories that are told in the West about their social credit system, that they really like it, and it's just helping everyone in China behave a little bit better. I don't know how far I can trust the Wikipedia entry. I go and read other sources, so it's very difficult to determine how developed the social credit system actually is. I'm absolutely willing to look at well-sourced evidence about it. But it seems like what they now have in China is a very an enormous network of security cameras that are linked into this social credit system, have very effective facial recognition, and also they can recognize you from your walk and other biometrics that are linked to. So if you, for instance, drop a piece of rubbish in a public place, that will be detected, and that will then have some knock-on effects. Now, I tend to the belief that this isn't all interconnected yet, because there are very major challenges with interconnecting all of this stuff. But that's the kind of challenge that LLMs, AIs, what we have at the moment of AI, is going to be really good at solving. Really, really good at solving. And it is going to pull this all together into just one giant gamified society that you live in. Wherever you go, whatever you do, it's not even that you're constantly monitored. You may well be, but you don't have to be monitored in your home. Your behavior in your home can be implied easily. And the AI is going to make kind of implied judgments of what you have done, and it may all get them wrong. But it doesn't even matter if it gets them right or wrong. And you can see what we're losing here completely is freedom. We have the technologies for absolute authoritarianism. Now, of course, I am not the first person to predict any of this. Orwell predicted this, of course. 1984 is the great warning against authoritarianism and totalitarianism. I'm using these words as kind of to give some kind of gradient, to recognize that there's going to be regimes on a spectrum in this. And they may be governments, they may be royal families. We have a big example of that in the world, very powerful royal family that basically owns a country that is named after it. These will come in all shapes and sizes, but they are fundamentally what Orwell was warning against. But when Orwell was warning against it, firstly, he was talking about the modern paradigm, which is explicitly dominating the population. And now we are into the postmodern authoritarian paradigm, which is these systems of control, but if you actually manage to escape those systems, there's then still brutal authority to put you back in your place. And Orwell couldn't quite see the technology. He had televisions that watched people. And we're far, far beyond that. Jeremy Bentham symbolized this as the panopticon, the tower in the center of a structure. And that structure is the prison, or is the factory, or is the office, but is ultimately your society. And there is a technological eye that can see all in your society. The great warnings against totalitarian evil, George Orwell's 1984, you have the eye of Big Brother that is watching you. Big Brother is watching you. And that is symbolized in many illustrations of Orwell's world in a single eye. You have the burning eye of Sauron in Lord of the Rings. Again, actually, if you think about it, Sauron is a technological power in the world of Middle-earth, industrializing that world and constantly watching all who might possess his ring that he needs to complete this trap that will never be escaped from. And this is why I'm scared. I have actual true fear of the situation approaching us, because the coping mechanism for this is to put it all far away. 30 years is far enough away that you decide not to worry about it. But I fear this is very much on the cards in the next 3 to 5 years. And this is not about the West being militarily invaded by Vladimir Putin, Europe being invaded, or China invading Taiwan. It's not just that Western military forces are still overwhelmingly superior. or that the game theory of using nuclear weapons tends to lead us to the idea that they're not going to be used in that sense, although as one of my good friends, Vlad Vexler, points out quite often, we probably have to expect some limited strategic use of nuclear weapons over the next century as a near absolute certainty, losing cities in the way that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were lost. And probably that scale of nuclear weapon as well. But we don't know. But none of that is the worry. The worry is much more immediate. That the reason, as an authoritarian dictator, which I think we must acknowledge that he is in Russia, the reason that Putin is playing this hand is that he believes absolutely in the collapse of the West. And we have quite possibly a very large economic crisis ahead of us. Now, I don't believe that that will be the end of capitalism. My position on this is that, or the end of the West, or the end of liberalism, my position on this is that actually our problem is that we have kept delaying our crises. There should have been one of our regular economic crises in 2008, and it was put off because we definitely have our own corruptions in the West, and people who were wealthy didn't want to lose their wealth in that situation. So we ended up in this kind of ridiculous zero interest world. But that's an economic analysis that I'm not really in a position to offer more here, but simply to say that there are major weaknesses in the liberal world, the Western world, and even the system of capitalism that, I'm quite generally critical of capitalism and its failings, but also hopeful about its potential to bring, on an ongoing basis, greater freedom, greater wealth, innovation, creativity to humankind. But we're approaching one of our crises, I think. And in that crisis, it's very likely that people all around the world who are already going in this direction are going to turn to authoritarianism. And there's a very credible scenario where you have authoritarians elected in the United States, in the European Union, both of which have elections this year, where it's very likely that strongly authoritarian candidates are going to do very well. Then a major economic crisis, and then a snap that could plunge us into global authoritarianism, concreted in with AI, utilitarian, authoritarian systems of control. And if this happens, it will really happen in a snap. And as that happens, many things that we believe couldn't happen now will begin to happen very quickly, especially in terms of the oppression of people who currently consider ourselves to be free. And this scenario is all there in place. And the real horror of this is that when this happened, when we had authoritarian outbreaks in the 20th century, or indeed in the 19th century, they were in this highly competitive world, and they were quite quickly outcompeted. The free world led by the United States, or just the United States alone, produced so many more arms and munitions because it was industrially so much more innovative, creative, and just fundamentally powerful than Nazi Germany. That there was never a chance of Nazi Germany winning that war. But this situation is very different because now we are becoming one global society. Unavoidably, inevitably. In fact, I think we could argue that we are already there. And this is a determination of what that global society is going to be. And if in just the space of a very few years, we hit that snap point of a combined crisis of capitalism, a shift to authoritarianism, and AI technology, there will be no way out of that situation. We will be a planetary population under the rule of what will then boil down to one ruling elite of some kind. It might even just be the Putin family. Don't take that as an unrealistic proposition. Remember when we were all watching pattern recognition? No, not pattern recognition. The William Gibson book that was just turned into a television series, The Peripheral. Both P's, okay? The Peripheral, and there's this kind of joke, side joke of the Putin diaspora in that, which is William Gibson is one of our canniest prophets of the near future. And this is what Putin, particularly, I think, is playing for. That would be my to try and understand Putin's strategy, is that he is playing for his heirs, the kind of gangster cabal he represents, more than his family, becoming the global ruling elite. He doesn't care what happens to the Russian people in that process. He just sees these pieces on the table, a crisis of capitalism, incredible technologies of authoritarian control that he has kind of perfected in Russia, authoritarian, utilitarian control, remember. And whilst in the midterm we may have a few dozen authoritarian regimes, once they have complete control and there is no democratic system to oppose them, they're just going to take their domestic populations and grind away in endless wars until there is only one population. And this is how Gidi Prime ended up under the rule of the Harkonnens. The Harkonnens, who you can look at as a kind of genetic civilization. They clearly, at some point in the history of Gidi Prime, the Harkonnens became the ruling elite, and then they've become kind of the only genetic stock. This is the potential horror story ahead of us, a kind of recreation of Genghis Khan on an even larger scale. That the Harkonnens are far beyond authoritarian or even totalitarian or even Nazi. Someone argued with me about the assertion that the Harkonnens were Nazi. You know, the Harkonnens are the absolute evil of complete control, of the absence of all freedom, of a world that is truly orderly. Gidi Prime is absolutely ordered, but in the eternal conflict between chaos and order, you need an eternal balance, an eternal struggle between the two. And what I fear is that we are heading towards the scenario that Frank Herbert warned us against, the planetary population dominated by an authoritarian or totalitarian, or ultimately the absolute pinnacle of evil. Earth as hell, humanity as the minions of hell realms ruled over. And we haven't faced this horror before because there's never been a global power. There was always the chance of outside intervention. But now I truly fear it's there. And I fear that people aren't aware, aren't thinking about it enough. And that leaves us blind to things like Luc Sessoint's free body problem, which is ultimately, for all its symbolic power, for all its tedious writing, a kind of propagandistic argument for absolute order. That if we're not to be exposed to the terrifying chaos of the universe, to the dark forest reality, we will have to. This also, I think, is one of the elements that eludes people a little bit about what authoritarian regimes argue for. That they don't argue that they're fun, that you're going to like them, that it's a good thing for you. They argue using rhetorical devices like the symbolism of the dark forest, that this is the only option. The other options are so much worse that you just have to knuckle down to the authorities. And those are my fears, and it's a genuine fear. on a personal level, because I'm not very well suited to authoritarian life as a writer and bohemian, hippie, I'm not going to prosper if that happens in 3 to 5 years. But on the civilizational level, because we could do so much better. And I think if the horror is of absolute control, then we have to balance that with a vision of freedom. The reason we're in this situation, as Friedrich Nietzsche argued, is because we have no myth, we have no story. And in the absence of a story, where do we end up? Nihilism, the ultimate word of authoritarianism, the ultimate philosophy of authoritarianism. Nihilism, believe in nothing. And what do we have to believe in? Nothing for many people at the moment. And so I've been looking for a long time for a 21st century mythos. And that started out as a way to explore more deeply into science fiction. It has become this ongoing discussion of where we are going as a civilization. Because as I form a deeper, more nuanced, hopefully more accurate understanding of our position, I see more and more that our mythos is at the heart of this. Because when people are buying into Liu Cixuan's very nihilistic vision of the possibilities of the future, and that's part of the issue with Liu Cixuan, it's not that this is a possible future, this is the only future that can unfold, is this deeply bleak and nihilistic future. What's leading people to that is the absence of any better vision. But even after some years now of looking for a 21st century mythos, some kind of answer to this question, I don't have a good answer. And that's quite predictable because it's a vast question with many complications. We might say that in a world of 8 billion, angling towards 9 billion people, how could one story possibly provide a vision for all in that? And that's an absolutely valid complication to raise in that quest for a vision. However, I still hold on to something like one unifying story. And perhaps one of the reasons I hold that is because I'm looking at the moment at many people in the world converting to Christianity, many people who I would not have expected that of. Now, there's a news story that has been made fun of Richard Dawkins talking about himself as a cultural Christian. That is not a conversion to Christianity, but in a way it's something more slippery. Richard Dawkins is the famous atheist in the world, and he's making a claim to be kind of culturally Christian, but not believing in the dogmatism of Christ. But actually even that is a somewhat dishonest claim. You can read The Selfish Gene, and half of that book, when he gets into memes and memetics, is really an argument about the fact that Christianity is just a set of infectious mind viruses that go around infecting literally stupid people. That is Dawkins' argument, even if he doesn't use that word. With this, and the only reason Christianity repeats is because it's this, it's good at infecting the minds of the credulous. That is Dawkins' argument. So for him to go from writing that in his 30s to now in his 80s, and you can understand some of the emotions that might underlie this, saying he's culturally Christian and he likes cathedrals and going to song services and so on. Well, it's not really that, is it, Richard? It's that what you found ultimately was nihilism. That without any story, without any mythos to guide you, what you face is the nihilistic possibility of absolute non-existence in the future. And it's too scary. So many people, I'm not going to go through a name list, but it's a real movement at the moment across many walks of life, because Christianity provides an answer to nihilism. I'm not going to try and represent what Christianity is here, other than to say that my understanding of Christianity is that it gives you an absolute order. There is a true and good order to the world. The world is made by God, not as a spaghetti monster who is an entity within the world, but God is the system of the world, and we can look at the world and we can see it is ordered, and this is what scientists believed as well. Not the God part, but if you're a scientist, you are invested in the belief that you can look at reality and it is comprehensible, and you can use experiment and observation and hypothesis and testing to actually understand the world. And the world must have an order that is comprehensible for that to be the case. So if you're a scientist, and I think this is why Dawkins is ultimately going to gravitate back to Christianity, if you're a scientist, you believe that there is an order, which also is given to you by Christianity, although the orders are quite different kinds, we might say. But nihilists don't believe that at all. They believe in chaos, absolute chaos. In fact, I don't even want to talk about nihilism as a belief, because that's somewhat the wrong way to phrase it. If you've been left with nihilism, if you've been left with nothing to believe in, if you have no story to order your reality, because our minds are storytelling machines. The story is the operating system of our consciousness, and we need a story to shape our perception of reality around. We must have a mythos, and many people are going to go back to, and already are, or never left, indeed, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism. Hinduism is a slightly different thing because it's such a big bag of different religions. People are going to go back to Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, perhaps as part of that. Although some might argue it is nihilistic, but okay, that's a bit of a complex rat hole to go down. So let's just put Vedanta on a shelf for a second. But people are going back to the big, old, grand stories of the past. People are going back to Marxism in quite unexpected ways. And I'm not sure any of this is a particularly good idea. These stories fail what we need for not just modernity or postmodernity, but meta-modernity, a new era that we can enter of hope, a new era of freedom, a new era that we can't really yet visualize. And the only symbol I see in our society, I don't have an answer to this question yet, but I think I have the symbol. The symbol that I think can be part of our hope for a free human future is the starship. The Starship Enterprise, the most famous starship, which is, what does the Starship Enterprise allow the crew of the Enterprise to do, especially once we get into the next generation? It allows them to stand outside worlds, entire worlds. It allows them to look down upon civilizations and understand their problems, understand the processes through which that civilization formed, to arrive at a civilization where half the population are black on one side and white on the other, and the other half of the population, that's reversed. That the Enterprise has the perspective to understand that situation and intervene in such a way as to improve it. The Enterprise can understand the geology of a planet, so it can drill down with its phasers to stop the planet exploding. But that's rather mundane in comparison to encountering the Borg, and over many encounters over many decades, being able to liberate the humanity within the Borg. And what allows the Enterprise to do this is the symbol of the starship. What is the Millennium Falcon? The Millennium Falcon allows Han and Leia and Luke and the Wookiee, Chewbacca, C-3PO, and even R2-D2 to escape the Empire and the control. It is a power that allows us to liberate ourselves from authoritarian and totalitarian control. And whilst the building of a starship is a little bit beyond us for the moment, I think we have to give old Elon, he's such a problematic figure. Dear Elon Musk, I wish you hadn't fallen down the postmodern propaganda rabbit hole, which has so muddled your mind, because you're doing good stuff, making rockets to the stars that give people hope, even if they aren't quite starships. Elon Musk is a great figure. I think the derogatory ways of thinking about him are a little bit unfortunate, but of course he has become somewhat addle-headed and speaks a load of gibberish a lot of the time. But we need the symbol of the starship for all that it gives us, the hope that we can liberate ourselves, that we can find the power to do that. But I think it's this vision of the civilization, because what we need at the moment are not consumers or even citizens. We need a mass population who understand this complex civilizational trap that we find ourselves within, because it's absolutely understandable that many people looking at the problems of our world, looking at the massive wealth disparities in the capitalist world, looking at the issues of nuclear weapons, looking at the issues of climate change, where this is another area where this arises, and environmentalism, might believe that the answer is some kind of authority that can come and solve the problem that we don't understand. But that is never the answer. Even in extremis, this is not the answer for humanity. We spent hundreds of thousands of years failing to progress through the Civ 5 tech development tree because we kept turning to corrupt authorities, or even when they were less corrupt authorities that still ultimately, in an attempt to provide absolute order, removed our human freedom. And the vast majority of human history, for the vast majority of humans who have ever lived, has been completely without freedom. And when we return to authorities and authoritarian systems, and of course, authorities play a role in a democratic world. This is why democracy is so important, is to balance the different epicenters of authority: the church, the state, the courts, the civil society institutions that we have today that allow us to keep our democracy. These must all be balanced. There are authorities in the world. I'm not an anarchist in my argument here. This is a slightly different argument, that we need something else instead, which is not to resign our authority to the authorities, but to regain our authority and sovereignty with a deepened and complexified understanding of the dynamics of our civilization. And that's what the starship in its journeys have given us. Think of all the conversations we've had about our civilization, not just our science fiction community, but the whole world of our civilization through the mirror that is Star Trek. How much complex and rich and deep our understanding of our civilizational situation is because of that symbol of the starship. And we need that symbol now more than ever before. I don't have a narrative to surround it yet. I am increasingly convinced that It's that symbol that will save us from Frank Herbert's nightmare of a planetary population held forever under the fist of the oil-covered Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, whatever his specific name would be in that nightmare future. And I hope this has served as some warning. I hope it hasn't been too dark. I hope we have some glimmer of light in the symbol of the starship. My name is Damien Walter. I'm going to leave you there. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.